Nathan Cole walked off the transport ship with a duffel bag over his right shoulder, and the look of a man who had learned long ago not to expect anything good from new situations, but who showed up anyway. He was 31 years old, average height for a human male, with short brown hair that he kept neat out of habit rather than vanity. His eyes were hazel, the kind that looked green in some light and brown in others, and they moved across the docking bay with a quiet attention that most people mistook for calm. It was not calm. It was the habit of a man who had spent years in places where not paying attention got people killed. The welcoming delegation was small. A young Savani aide he would later learn was named Doran, 2 station security officers, and a human woman in a crisp diplomatic uniform who stepped forward with her hand extended. Sergeant Cole, I am Lieutenant Megan Price, Human Liaison Office. Welcome to Aurelis Prime. Thank you, Lieutenant. Megan fell into step beside him as the group moved through the wide corridors of the station. Everything was built on a Savani scale, which meant the ceilings were high and the hallways were broad, and Nathan felt small in a way that had nothing to do with his height. The walls were a pale material that seemed to glow faintly from within, and the air smelled clean in a way that felt almost artificial, like someone had removed all the interesting parts of breathing. I want to be straight with you, Megan said as they walked. Ambassador Velshin is not happy about this arrangement. She has made her objections known to her government, to the Galactic Accord, and to anyone on this station who will listen. She considers humans to be culturally inferior, and she considers this bonding mandate to be an insult to her personally. Nathan nodded. Okay, that does not bother you. I have been shot at by things with 6 legs and acid for blood, Nathan said. I think I can handle a diplomat who does not like me. The first formal meeting took place the next morning in a reception hall near the center of the station. The room was designed for Savani ceremonies, with tall columns of that same glowing material and a floor that reflected light like still water. Nathan wore his dress uniform, which he had pressed the night before with an iron he borrowed from a maintenance closet, because the human quarters did not have one. Liara arrived exactly on time. She wore formal Savani robes that flowed like liquid silver around her tall frame, and her feathered crest was decorated with thin chains of crystal that caught the light and scattered it in small rainbows across the walls. She was, Nathan realized, the most striking person he had ever seen. She was also looking at him, the way someone might look at a stain on an expensive carpet. Sergeant Cole, she said in Galactic Common. Her voice was precise and cold. The air around her seemed to drop in temperature, and Nathan felt a strange pressure against his mind that he guessed was the edge of her telepathic ability pressing outward. It felt like standing too close to a window in winter. Ambassador Velshin, he said. He did not try to shake her hand or bow, or do anything he was not certain was appropriate. Instead, he reached into his bag and brought out a small wooden box. He had carved it himself during the 2-week journey from Earth, using a folding knife and a piece of cedar he had packed specifically for this purpose. This is for you, he said. It contains dried lavender. It is a plant from Earth. Where I come from, people associate it with peace and calm. I thought it might be a good way to start. Liara took the box without opening it. She examined it for exactly 2 seconds, then handed it to Doran like it was a piece of paperwork she had finished reviewing. Thank you, she said, in a tone that meant the opposite. I trust your quarters are satisfactory. If you need anything, Doran will assist you. And then she left. The meeting had lasted less than 4 minutes. Over the next several days, Liara treated Nathan the way a busy person treats a piece of furniture they keep walking around but never sit on. She acknowledged his presence when protocol demanded it, and ignored him the rest of the time. Nathan did not push. Instead, he did what he had always done when dropped into an unfamiliar place. He paid attention and he learned. He spent hours in the station library, reading about Savani culture, their history, their values. He learned that they had a deep respect for knowledge and craftsmanship, that their bonding rituals involved telepathic sharing of memories, and that physical touch between Savani carried far more meaning than it did between humans, because of their touch telepathy. He understood then why the idea of bonding with a human must feel so invasive to Liara, and he filed that understanding away quietly. He asked Doran to teach him basic Savani phrases. His pronunciation was terrible. The Savani language relied on subtle tonal shifts and harmonic layering that the human throat was not designed to produce, and his attempts sounded to Savani ears roughly the way a dog trying to play a violin would sound to human ears. But he kept trying, and Doran, who seemed to find the whole thing both painful and endearing, kept correcting him. The moment that mattered most happened on the 5th day. Nathan was walking through a public corridor near the education wing when he passed a group of Savani children on a guided tour of the station. Most of them stared at him with open curiosity. One small child at the back of the group, barely waist-high, looked at him and burst into tears. The tour guide looked mortified. The other children pulled away. Nathan stopped walking and slowly, carefully, knelt down so that he was at the child's eye level. He moved without hurry. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin napkin from the cafeteria, and using both hands with practiced ease, folded it into a small paper bird. He held it out on his open palm. The child stared at it through wet eyes. Nathan waited. After a long moment, the child reached out and took the bird, turning it over in small silver fingers with an expression of confused wonder. The child looked up at Nathan's face, as if seeing it for the first time, and finding it less frightening than expected. Nathan smiled gently, stood up, and continued walking. He did not know that Liara was watching from the far end of the corridor. She had been on her way to a meeting, and had stopped when she saw the commotion. She watched the entire scene, the kneeling, the paper bird, the patience, and she said nothing. Her expression did not change, but she stood there for several seconds after Nathan disappeared around a corner, looking at the space where he had been. That evening, alone in her quarters, Liara sat cross-legged on her meditation mat, and tried to find the still center of her mind, the way she had been trained since childhood. It would not come. Her thoughts kept circling back to the image of a human man, kneeling on a station floor, making a toy out of nothing for a child who was afraid of him. He was not what she had expected. She admitted this to herself in the privacy of her own mind, where no one could hear it. He was quiet, where she had expected noise. He was careful, where she had expected carelessness. He was trying to understand her people in a way that she had never tried to understand his. But she told herself, it changed nothing. One kind gesture did not erase the fundamental gap between their species. One paper bird did not make a human worthy of a Savani bond. The intelligence report came in at 3 a.m. station time. And by sunrise, everything on Aurelius Prime had changed. A remnant cell of the Dreth swarm had been tracked moving through the Koreth Nebula on a trajectory that brought them dangerously close to the station. The Dreth did not travel unless they intended to attack. Their ships were fast, their soldiers were brutal, and they held grudges with a patience that bordered on religious devotion. The coalition had beaten them back 8 months ago, and they had not forgotten. Commander Hale Prescott, the station's head of security, was a human in his 50s, with gray hair cut close to his skull, and a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts left over from harder men. He called an emergency briefing within the hour. The room was packed with military officers, diplomats, and station administrators from 6 different species, and the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. We have confirmed 3 Dreth assault craft and 1 carrier-class vessel, Prescott said, pointing to a tactical display that floated above the table. Current estimates put them at 48 hours out. We are evacuating non-essential personnel on the next available transports. Essential diplomatic and military staff will remain. Liara sat near the head of the table, her expression controlled, her crest held perfectly still. She began coordinating with the Savani defense liaisons immediately, organizing supply chains and communication protocols with the kind of crisp efficiency that reminded everyone why she held her position. Nathan sat near the back of the room and listened. When the briefing ended, he approached Commander Prescott and offered his services. He was a combat medic with field experience against the Dreth. He knew how they fought, how they moved through enclosed spaces, and how to treat the specific injuries their weapons caused. Prescott looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and assigned him to the defensive planning team. Over the next 36 hours, the station transformed. Corridors were barricaded. Emergency shelters were prepared. Medical bays were stocked with supplies that Nathan personally inventoried because he trusted his own hands more than a computer when lives might depend on it. He worked alongside station security officers, both human and Savani, and they began to rely on his calm, methodical approach to preparation. Liara noticed. She did not want to notice, but Nathan kept appearing in places where things needed doing, and he kept doing them well. He did not seek attention or credit. He simply moved through the station like water finding cracks, filling gaps that no one else had seen. It irritated her deeply. The confrontation happened during a joint tactical briefing on the second day. Prescott had asked Nathan to present his recommendations for medical triage positioning. Nathan suggested moving the secondary medical station from its current location to a lower deck near the engineering section, arguing that the Dreth preferred to breach through service corridors and that casualties would be heaviest near those access points. Liara interrupted him. The engineering section is a strategic asset. Placing medical staff there diverts security resources to protect them. It is an inefficient use of personnel. He pulled up casualty data from the Siege of Korvan and 3 other Dreth engagements, showing that 70% of fatalities in station-based attacks occurred within the first 10 minutes in areas adjacent to service corridors, and that the primary cause of death was not the initial injury, but the delay in reaching medical care. If we cut response time by even 3 minutes, Nathan said, we save roughly 1 in 4 of those people. The room was quiet. Prescott looked at the data, then at Liara, then back at Nathan. Move the medical station, Prescott said. Liara said nothing for the rest of the briefing. Her face was perfectly composed, but her crest had gone very still, in the way it did when she was fighting to control herself. She found Nathan that evening in one of the supply corridors, checking inventory on a crate of emergency medical kits. The corridor was empty and dim, lit only by the low emergency lighting that had replaced the station's normal illumination to conserve power. You made me look foolish in that briefing, she said. Nathan closed the crate and stood up. That was not my intention. Your intention does not matter. The result is the same. These officers look to me for leadership, and you undermined my authority in front of all of them. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was not angry. It was not defensive. It was simply honest in a way that caught Liara off guard. Ambassador, I did not undermine you. I presented information that I believed could save lives, and I let the room decide. That is all I did. He paused. I did not choose this arrangement. I know you did not either. But I will not stand quietly and let people die because I am afraid of making you uncomfortable. And I will not apologize for being useful. Liara opened her mouth to respond, but Nathan continued. I have spent my life around people in pain, he said. I have held soldiers while they died. I have looked into the eyes of people who were terrified and told them it was going to be okay, even when I knew it was not. I know what anger looks like, and I know what fear looks like, and they are not the same thing. He looked at her steadily. You are not angry at me, Ambassador. You are afraid. And I am sorry for whatever I represent that frightens you, but I am not your enemy. The silence that followed was heavy. Liara could feel the truth of his words through her telepathy. There was no deception in him, no manipulation. There was only a deep, tired patience, and something underneath it that she could not name. Something warm and steady like a fire kept burning through a long winter. She left without responding, because she did not trust what she might say. The attack came 6 hours later. The Dreth breached the outer hull in 3 places simultaneously. Alarms screamed through every corridor. Emergency bulkheads slammed down, cutting the station into isolated sections. The lights went red. The floor shook. Liara was near the service sector when the closest breach tore through the wall 30 meters ahead of her. The sound was terrible, a shrieking of metal, and a sudden roaring rush of air as atmosphere began venting into space. Doran was with her, along with 2 Savani civilians who had been moving to an emergency shelter. Shrapnel from the breach caught Doran in the side, and he went down hard. Liara pulled him behind a support column. The air was getting thin. The emergency sealant systems had failed in this section, and she could feel the cold of vacuum creeping through the breach. The 2 civilians were pressed against the wall, eyes wide with terror. She did not know where help was. She did not know if anyone knew they were here. Nathan knew. He had been in the medical bay when the breach alarms triggered, and he heard the location report for the service sector failure. He grabbed a field kit and moved. A security officer tried to stop him, telling him the section was sealed. Nathan found a maintenance shaft that ran parallel to the corridor and crawled through it in the dark, navigating by memory of the station layouts he had studied obsessively for the past 2 days. He came through a ceiling panel and dropped into the corridor 10 meters from Liara's position. He assessed the situation in seconds. He applied emergency hull sealant to the breach, a temporary patch that stopped the air loss. He knelt beside Doran and treated the shrapnel wound with fast, practiced hands, stopping the bleeding and stabilizing him with supplies from his kit. A Dreth scout drone came around the corner. Nathan drew his sidearm and destroyed it with 2 shots before it could transmit their position. Then he heard the secondary explosion coming. A deep rumble through the floor that meant something structural was failing nearby. He grabbed Liara and the 2 civilians and pushed them behind a heavy bulkhead frame, shielding them with his body as the blast wave hit. When the reinforcements arrived 20 minutes later, they found Nathan standing in the damaged corridor. His left arm was bleeding from a wound he had already bandaged with a torn strip of his own sleeve. Doran was stable on the floor behind him. Liara and the civilians were unharmed. Prescott looked at the scene, and then at Nathan. You went through the maintenance shaft. Yes, sir. Against orders. Yes, sir. Prescott shook his head and said nothing else, which from him was the highest form of approval. In the medical bay afterward, Liara sat beside Doran's recovery pod and watched the monitors track his vital signs. Across the room, a medic was cleaning and properly treating the wound on Nathan's arm. He sat patiently on the edge of a medical table, looking tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He looked up and caught her watching him. He gave her a small nod. Not a smile, not a performance, just a quiet acknowledgement that they were both still alive. Liara looked away, but something inside her chest that had been locked tight for a very long time had cracked open, and she could feel the warmth getting in. The weeks after the Dreth attack were quiet in the way that follows loud things. Aurelis Prime was wounded. Entire sections of the station were sealed off for repair. The remaining population was compressed into a smaller area, which meant that people who had previously been able to avoid each other now could not. Liara and Nathan were among them. Liara began to watch him. She told herself it was observation, the same way a diplomat observes a counterpart to understand their patterns and weaknesses. She told herself it was strategic. But the truth was simpler than that, and she knew it, even if she was not ready to say it out loud. Nathan woke early every morning. She knew this because she woke early too, a habit carried over from childhood on 7 Prime, where the crystal forests caught the first light at dawn, and the whole world sang. She would pass the small cargo bay that had been converted into an exercise space, and see him through the open door, moving through a routine of stretches and controlled movements that were nothing like the violent training she had imagined. He moved with focus and precision, breathing steadily, his eyes closed sometimes, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. It reminded her, uncomfortably, of Savani meditative practice. His datapad screen was visible one morning when she passed his open door, and she saw the beginning of a message addressed to someone named Katie Cole, his sister. The letter began with a joke about the food on the station tasting like cardboard dipped in hope, and then shifted into something warmer, asking about her classes, telling her about the stars visible from the observation deck, promising that he was safe, in a way that managed to sound reassuring without sounding like a lie. The letter was gentle and funny, and full of a protective love that Liara recognized, because it was the same thing she felt for Doran, though she would never have expressed it so openly. The signs of his damage were harder to see, but Liara's telepathy made them impossible to ignore. Nathan did not sleep well. She could feel the disturbance from his quarters at night, muffled waves of distress that leaked through the walls despite his efforts to contain them. He startled at sudden noises, the slam of a door, the clang of a tool dropped in the corridor, though he hid the reaction so quickly that no one without telepathic sensitivity would have caught it. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of a task and stare at nothing, his eyes fixed on a point in empty air, and Liara could feel the emotional echo of whatever memory had surfaced, something gray and heavy, smelling of smoke and fear. And underneath all of it, underneath the discipline and the scars and the sleepless nights, there was something else, a stubborn warmth, a refusal to stop caring about people, even though caring had clearly cost him more than most beings would be willing to pay. Liara did not understand it. Among the Savani, emotional investment was measured and controlled, distributed carefully to minimize risk. Nathan seemed to operate on the opposite principle. He gave everything and accepted the consequences. And then he got up the next morning and did it again. The artificial day-night cycle failed during the 3rd week of repairs, plunging their section of the station into a permanent dim twilight. The repair team said it would take days to fix. People adapted. The corridors felt smaller in the low light, more intimate, as if the station itself was drawing its inhabitants closer together. Liara found Nathan in the observation lounge late one evening. He was sitting in a chair pulled close to the wide window, looking out at the stars with the expression of a man visiting an old friend. The room was empty except for him. Liara almost turned and left, but something stopped her. She walked to a chair near his and sat down without speaking. They sat in silence for a long time. The stars moved slowly past the window as the station maintained its gentle rotation. "Montana has a big sky," Nathan said eventually, as if they had already been in the middle of a conversation. "That is the thing people always say about it, that the sky is big, and I always thought that was a stupid thing to say, because the sky is the same everywhere. But it is not. It is different there. It feels closer, like you could reach up and touch it." He paused. "My family has land near a river. Not much land. Enough. There are mountains to the west, and in winter the snow sits on them like someone laid a white sheet over the tops. The river freezes at the edges, but the middle keeps moving. You can hear it at night if the wind is quiet. Liara listened. She did not interrupt. During the siege of Corvan, when things got bad, I used to close my eyes and go back to that river, Nathan said. I would listen to the water and pretend I could feel the cold air on my face. It kept me steady. It kept me here. He looked at her. I imagine you have a place like that too. Liara was quiet for so long that Nathan probably thought she was not going to answer. Then she spoke, and her voice was different than he had ever heard it. Not the sharp, controlled voice of the ambassador, but something softer and less certain. The crystal forests of 7 Prime, she said. The trees are not really trees. They are mineral formations, very tall, very thin, with hollow cores. When the wind passes through them, they vibrate, and each one produces a different tone, depending on its size and shape. An entire forest sounds like an orchestra tuning itself. As a child, I believed they were talking to each other. I would sit among them and try to learn their language. She paused. I have never told that to anyone who is not Savani. It was a small smile, barely there, but it reached his eyes. Thank you for telling me. After that night, something shifted between them. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment where everything changed. It was more like a door that had been locked was now open just a crack, and neither of them tried to close it. Nathan taught Liara a card game from Earth called Crazy Eights. She found the rules illogical and the name absurd, but she played 3 rounds and won 2 of them, which she attributed to superior Savani pattern recognition, and which Nathan attributed to her cheating. She did not cheat, but she did not correct his accusation, because his expression when he said it made her want to laugh, and she was not ready to examine why. Liara corrected his Savani pronunciation during their conversations. His accent was still terrible, but it had improved from painful to merely awkward. And when he managed to correctly say a particularly difficult phrase one afternoon, she made a sound of surprised approval that Doran, passing by in the corridor, would later describe as the closest thing to genuine delight he had ever heard from her. She contacted her mother, High Speaker Thesara, for their regular communication. For the first time since the mandate was announced, she did not complain. She reported on the station repairs, the security improvements, the diplomatic schedule. When Thesara asked about the human, Liara said only that the arrangement was proceeding. Thesara's expression shifted in a way that suggested she noticed the change, but she said nothing. The night it happened, Liara was in her quarters, preparing for sleep. She felt it first as a tremor at the edge of her telepathic awareness. A wave of raw emotion, sharp and jagged, breaking through the walls between their adjacent rooms. Fear. Not the controlled, manageable fear of a waking mind, but the wild, thrashing terror of a nightmare that had its claws sunk deep. She went to his door. It was unlocked. She found him sitting on the edge of his bunk, awake, his hands pressed flat against his thighs. His breathing was ragged. His face was damp. He looked up when she entered, and she saw in his eyes the same look she had seen in the eyes of the child who cried at the sight of him. Raw, unguarded vulnerability. She did not ask what he had dreamed. She sat beside him on the bunk, and without thinking, without planning, she placed her hand over his. The contact hit her like stepping into sunlight after years in a dark room. Savani touch telepathy opened a channel between them, and suddenly she was inside his memories. The bunker on Corvan, the dust and the screaming, the weight of a wounded soldier on his back, the face of a young man he could not save, looking up at him with eyes that were already going empty. She felt his grief, not as a distant concept, but as a living thing that he carried every day. She felt his loneliness, deep and old, and so familiar that it made her chest ache because she recognized it. She had carried the same weight for years and never let anyone close enough to see it. She did not pull away. She stayed beside him, her hand over his, until his breathing slowed, and the shaking stopped, and the room was quiet again. Back in her own quarters afterward, Liara lay on her back and stared at the ceiling. The truth she had been running from had finally caught her, and it stood in the middle of her mind and refused to move. She did not merely tolerate Nathan Cole, she respected him. And something deeper than respect, something she had no Savani word for, was growing in the space he had quietly made inside her. Aurelis Prime healed slowly, the way living things do. The damaged sections were rebuilt stronger than before, the corridors repainted, the systems restored. The station hummed again, with the steady pulse of a place that had survived something terrible, and come out the other side, still standing. The coalition rallied around the story of the attack and the defense, and the Union mandate, which had once been a quiet political arrangement, became a symbol of something larger. The bonding ceremony between Ambassador Liara Velsheen and Sergeant Nathan Cole was no longer just a transaction. It was a statement. And for the first time since the mandate had been placed in her hands, Liara did not dread it. She stood in her quarters on the morning of the ceremony, dressed in traditional Savani bonding robes, white this time, not silver, because white was the color of beginning. The fabric was woven from silk thread, a material produced only on 7 Prime, and it caught the light in ways that made it seem like she was wrapped in something alive. Her crest was unadorned, which was the Savani custom for bonding. No jewelry, no chains, nothing between the self and the other. Doran helped her with the final adjustments to the robe's clasps. He moved carefully, still favoring his left side, where the shrapnel wound had healed into a thin scar he would carry for the rest of his life. He was quiet for most of the preparation, which was unusual for Doran, and Liara eventually looked at him and raised an eyebrow. "You have something to say?" she said. "He asked me," Doran said. "Weeks ago. He asked me to teach him the bonding responses. The Savani words, the gestures, the timing. He has been practicing every night after his shifts. His pronunciation is still not good, but he has memorized every line." Doran paused and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "He wants to do this right, Ambassador. Not because he has to. Because he wants to." Liara said nothing. She turned back to the mirror and looked at her own reflection, and the woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized. Not because she looked different, but because something behind her eyes had changed. In another part of the station, Nathan Cole stood in front of a small mirror in his quarters and straightened the collar of his dress uniform. The uniform was dark blue with silver accents, pressed and perfect. His medals were pinned in a straight line above his left pocket. The Combat Medic's Cross, the Valor Citation from Corvan, the Coalition Service Ribbon. He had polished each one that morning, not out of pride, but out of respect for the people whose lives were connected to each piece of metal. Lieutenant Megan Price knocked on his open door and leaned against the frame. "How are you doing?" Nathan adjusted his cuffs. "Nervous." "About the ceremony?" "No. The ceremony I can handle. The words, the ritual, the room full of people, that is just performance." He was quiet for a moment. "I am nervous about not being enough. She is extraordinary, Megan. She is brilliant and fierce, and she carries the weight of her entire people on her shoulders. And she has spent the last several months learning to trust someone she was taught to look down on. That took more courage than anything I have ever done on a battlefield, and I am afraid that I am not worthy of what she is offering." Megan looked at him for a long moment. "Nathan, the fact that you think that way is exactly why you are. Anyone who worries about deserving someone's trust is usually the person who deserves it most." The ceremony took place in the grand atrium of Aurelis Prime. The space had been transformed for the occasion. The tall columns were draped with living light, bioluminescent filaments cultivated from 7 Prime, that pulsed gently in shades of blue and white, like a slow heartbeat made visible. The floor had been cleared and polished until it reflected the lights above like a lake reflecting stars. Dignitaries from 12 species filled the tiered galleries that lined the walls. Savani, human, and a dozen others, seated together in a way that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Liara entered from the eastern archway. Nathan entered from the west. They walked toward each other across the open floor, and the room fell silent, except for the soft pulse of the bioluminescent lights. Nathan looked up at her, as they met in the center. She was nearly a foot taller than him, and in her white robes, with the living light moving across her silver skin, she looked like something from a story he might have heard as a child. Something beautiful and impossible and real. He did not feel small beside her. He felt steady. He felt like the ground she could stand on. The Savani bonding ritual was built around 3 elements: light, song, and the sharing of self. A Savani elder named Counselor Vane presided, speaking the ancient words in a voice that resonated through the chamber, like the deep tones of the crystal forests. Nathan responded in Savani at each required moment, and his pronunciation was imperfect but clear, and the effort behind each syllable was audible to everyone in the room. Several Savani dignitaries exchanged glances of surprise. A human diplomat in the gallery wiped her eyes. The final and most sacred element of the Savani bond. Counselor Van explained it for the benefit of the non-Savani audience. The sharing required both participants to open their minds completely to each other, to lower every defense, every wall, every carefully constructed barrier, and allow the other person to see them fully. For the Savani, this was the deepest act of trust their culture recognized. It was more intimate than any physical act. It was the giving of self without reservation. Liara looked at Nathan. He looked at her. She extended her hands, palms up, and he placed his hands in hers. The contact was immediate and total. The telepathic channel opened like a door thrown wide, and suddenly, Liara was inside Nathan Cole. Not his memories this time, but his whole self, the full landscape of who he was. She saw the boy in Montana, lying on his back in tall grass, watching the sky turn orange at sunset, feeling small and amazed, and full of a wonder that he never lost, even when the world tried to beat it out of him. She saw the young soldier, holding a dying stranger's hand, in the mud of a planet whose name she could not pronounce, whispering that he was not alone, that someone was here, that it was okay to let go. She saw the brother, writing letters full of bad jokes, because he knew his sister worried, and he would rather make her laugh than let her carry his pain. She saw the man who knelt on a station floor and made a paper bird for a frightened child, because kindness was not something he performed, but something he was. She saw the man who learned a language his throat could barely shape, because he wanted to show respect to a woman who had given him none. She felt his fear, not of her, but of failing her. She felt his hope, bruised and battered but still breathing. And she felt his love, which was not the dramatic consuming fire she had been taught to associate with human emotion. It was something quieter, something patient, something that moved like a river that never stopped, that wore down stone not through force, but through the simple refusal to give up. Nathan, in turn, felt Liara open to him. He experienced her pride and her loneliness, the enormous weight of expectations placed on her since childhood, the pressure to be perfect and controlled and never vulnerable. He felt the quiet shame she carried for looking down on his species, and the confusion that had followed when he refused to match the picture she had painted of humanity. He felt the night she sat beside his bunk and held his hand, and the way her heart had cracked open at the touch, and the terror and relief of discovering that she was not as alone as she had always believed. When they separated, The atrium was perfectly silent. Liara was crying. The tears ran down her silver cheeks and caught the bioluminescent light, and no one in the room could remember ever seeing a Savani ambassador weep in public. The tears were not grief. They were the release of something that had been held too tightly for too long. She turned to face the assembly, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, even though her eyes were wet. "I was taught to fear humanity," she said. "I was taught that they were lesser, that they were crude, emotional, and unworthy of Savani respect. I believed this. I carried that belief into this arrangement, like armor, certain that it would protect me from what I was being asked to do." The room did not breathe. I was wrong, not because Nathan Cole is exceptional among humans, but because the qualities I dismissed as weaknesses, their empathy, their stubbornness, their refusal to stop feeling, even when feeling causes them pain, are not weaknesses at all. They are the very things that make them remarkable. Nathan Cole taught me that strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the courage to remain open when everything inside you is telling you to close. If this is what humanity is, then the galaxy is better and richer and kinder for their presence in it. She looked at Nathan. The room looked at Nathan. He stood beside her in his blue uniform, with his medals catching the light, and he did not make a speech. He was a man who had always been better at doing than saying. He simply took her hand, looked up at her, and smiled. Applause from the humans, harmonic resonance from the Savani, a deep vibrating hum that was their highest expression of communal approval, and sounds of celebration from a dozen other species, each in their own way. The noise washed over them both like a wave, and Nathan held her hand through all of it. Weeks later, long after the ceremony had been recorded in the official archives of the Galactic Accord, and long after the last dignitary had departed, Liara and Nathan stood together on the observation deck. A fleet of coalition ships was forming up outside the station, preparing for departure to the frontier. The ships moved slowly against the black, their running lights blinking like earthbound fireflies, and the two of them watched in silence, the way people do when words are not necessary. "Do you still fear it?" Nathan asked. "The Union." Liara considered the question. The station hummed beneath their feet. "I fear many things," she said. "The breath, the future, the size of the universe, and how small we are inside it." She paused. "But I do not fear you. I do not fear this." She leaned into him slightly, just enough that her shoulder pressed against his. It was a gesture so small that a human would barely notice it. But in Savani terms, it was an act of profound intimacy, a voluntary closing of distance, a choosing of nearness over solitude. Nathan, who had studied enough to understand what it meant, went very still, and then leaned back, just slightly, returning the pressure. "You changed everything," Liara said quietly. "Not by being extraordinary, not by being more than what you are. You changed everything by being unrelentingly, stubbornly, beautifully human." Nathan did not answer, because some things do not need answers. He just stood beside her in the low light of the observation deck, holding the silence between them like something precious, and together they watched the stars. The notification arrived on a Tuesday, which Liara Velsheen would later think was a stupid detail to remember, but she remembered it anyway. She was sitting in her office aboard Aurelius Prime, the largest diplomatic station in the outer ring of coalition space, reviewing trade agreements that bored her to the edge of sleep. Her aide, a young Savani named Doran, walked in with a sealed transmission tube and a face that told her something was very wrong. "Ambassador," he said, and then stopped talking, which was unusual for Doran, because he normally talked too much. Liara took the cube from his hand and activated it. A holographic document unfolded in the air between them, stamped with the seal of the Galactic Accord and co-signed by the Savani High Council. She read it once quickly, then again slowly, and then a third time because she was certain her eyes were broken. The Union Mandate, a new diplomatic initiative requiring political bonding ceremonies between allied species to strengthen coalition unity. And attached to the mandate, like a knife hidden inside a gift, was her name beside the name of a human male. Sergeant First Class Nathan Cole, United Planetary Defense Corps, Earth. No, Liara said. Doran shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The High Council has already approved it. Then the High Council has lost its mind. She stood up from her desk. She was tall even by Savani standards, nearly 7 feet, with smooth silver skin that caught the light like polished metal. A crest of delicate feathered tendrils ran from the crown of her skull to the base of her neck, and they flared slightly when she was angry. They were flaring now. Her iridescent eyes, which shifted between violet and pale gold, depending on her mood, had gone very dark. Liara had spent 23 years building her career in diplomacy. She had negotiated ceasefire agreements with species that ate their enemies. She had brokered resource treaties across systems that had been at war for generations. She was one of the most respected voices in the Savani Dominion. And now her government was asking her to marry a human. Not marry, she corrected herself, bond. The Savani did not use the human word because the Savani considered their bonding rituals to be something far deeper and more sacred than anything humans were capable of. The idea of sharing that ritual with a human made her feel physically ill. She contacted the High Council within the hour. The holographic conference chamber filled with the translucent blue images of the 12 council members, seated in their carved stone chairs on 7 Prime. At the center sat her mother, High Speaker Thasara Velsheen, whose expression was as warm as frozen steel. "You cannot ask this of me," Liara said, and she hated that her voice trembled slightly. "We are not asking," her mother replied. "The Dreth swarm nearly destroyed our northern colonies 8 months ago. Human soldiers died defending our borders. Their government has requested a gesture of lasting unity, and we have agreed. You were chosen because you are the best we have. That is not a compliment, Liara. It is a responsibility. There are other ways to honor an alliance, none that carry the same weight. The coalition is watching. If we refuse, we appear ungrateful. If we appear ungrateful, we lose human military support. If we lose human military support, the Dreth will return and finish what they started." Thasara paused. "You will do this." Liara stood alone in the conference chamber for a long time. That night, she pulled up everything she could find on Nathan Cole. His military file was straightforward, and to her eyes, deeply unimpressive. Born in a place called Montana, which she learned was a cold, mountainous region on Earth. Enlisted in the military at 18. Served as a combat medic, which meant he was trained to keep people alive in the middle of violence. He had fought in 3 major campaigns, including something called the Siege of Corvan, where according to the report, he had crawled into a collapsing bunker under enemy fire and dragged out 7 wounded soldiers, one at a time. There were commendations. There were scars listed in his medical file. There was a note from a military psychologist that flagged signs of post-traumatic stress, managed but present. Liara closed the file and leaned back in her chair. A soldier, a human who resolved problems with his hands and a weapon. A man shaped by blood and noise and the worst things the galaxy could throw at a person. She tried to imagine sitting across from him at a dinner table. Tried to imagine his rough human voice in her quarters. Tried to imagine his blunt human emotions crashing against her telepathic senses like waves against a wall. And she could not make the picture fit inside her mind without everything in her recoiling. The Savani were a refined people. They communicated through carefully structured language and subtle telepathic impressions. They valued stillness, precision, and emotional control. Their art was mathematical. Their music was architecture made of sound. They had looked out at the galaxy and found most species lacking, but humans occupied a special place at the bottom of their estimation. Humans were loud, they were chaotic. They lived barely a century, which meant they rushed through everything with a frantic energy that the Savani found exhausting. They waged wars with each other for reasons that made no sense. They let their emotions drive them like animals, and called it passion. And now one of them was going to be her bonded partner. Doran found her later on the observation deck, a wide curved window that looked out into the black. A human transport ship had docked at the far end of the station an hour ago. She had watched it approach, a boxy, graceless vessel with scorch marks on its hull, and a name painted on the side that she had not bothered to read. Somewhere inside that ship was Nathan Cole, and in a matter of days she would be expected to stand beside him and pretend that this arrangement was anything other than a punishment disguised as politics. "Ambassador," Doran said quietly from behind her, "the welcome delegation is being assembled for tomorrow morning. Do you wish to attend?" The stars outside were cold and very far away. "I would rather face the Dreth again," she said in Savani, and she meant every word. Doran wisely said nothing, and left her alone with the dark.